And so when I was asked to take a lecture on religion, I sort of agreed, simply for the reason that I thought it will be, for me, a personal journey into understanding religion in India, probably not as a faithful, in terms of believing in various gods, but in terms of a faithful in humankind. So today I will be taking a lecture on religion. I'm repeating myself. I'll be taking a lecture on religion with a sort of humble submission that I don't know a lot about various religions, but I am keen on understanding and knowing. And from whatever little I read, and I have been reading as a sociologist, and as also a person who's interested, who's fascinated by religion, in the fact that despite tremendous change, progress, growth of science, religion persists and matters in various ways, in subtle ways, in ways that we don't even realize. Many of us enjoy Ganesh Chaturthi, we make rangolis, probably not even visit a temple, but we enjoy the festivities, Deepavali, Eid. We enjoy all the festivities and probably are one of the most irreligious people that you could come across. So there's something wonderful and sort of spiritual about religion that attracts all of us. But there are many things about religion that have been criticized through history. So for me, it was essential to really understand laptop battery critically low, right? Need to charge it? Oops. Okay. So as I was telling you, and because of divine intervention, I had to stop. So anyway, so please have patience and let me first complete what I need to say. What I would sort of try to do is communicate my sense of, religion in India and how I read religion in India. Much of it is derived by my discipline, sociology, but also the sense that I have accumulated through all these years by traveling across the country about religion. So I think it'll be interspersed with my own sense of religion in India, which, if I must confess, is not on the negative side, because I see tremendous power and potential in religion, both to create and to destroy. So it's important to recognize the potential and strength of religion. On which side you're on is a different matter. But first you need to understand the power of religion among people, the importance of religion among people, what it means to people, how it affects society, how are different people relating to religious phenomenon. It's important to understand those things. Unless we understand that, we won't know the significance of religion. And it's very easy to dismiss religion sitting in our drawing rooms when you know very well that in ordinary lives, in people's lives, even in a slum of Govandi, right there, Ganpati celebrations are, Eid has just got over, Ganpati celebrations have started. Whether they have money or not, everybody is going to celebrate. Right? So religion has a sort of a power which moves people. We need to understand where that comes from. What is it about? And sort of distance ourselves from sort of the positions we take to comprehend its power. So all I'm requesting you is to have patience and let me just say what I need to say. Probably you will differ, and reasonably so. Probably you know more than me on that matter. But first, hear me out. Is there something you want to tell me? You're sharing something with your friends. So if there's something you want to tell me, you can share it. I'm going to start, but I need to give a sort of a background, right? That's what I was doing, and there's a lot of disturbance. And then the laptop sort of went off. I needed to kind of get you back into the fold, right? So I'm starting. It can even end for you. You can walk out. Okay, so what am I going to do through this lecture? One, I'm going to really get into the question of what is sociology of religion. First, I will try and define how religion has been ordinarily kind of defined, and then go on to what is sociology of religion. And then what have been the main approaches to study religion. This is the second part that I would be doing. The third section would specifically focus on religion in India, where I will provide a sort of a profile of religions in India and a brief history of, how different religions have, grown, evolved over centuries in India, with the idea of really presenting a dynamic view of religion in India. That religion has been essentially and primarily very dynamic in India. It's not been static as it's been sort of, presented to the outside world. It's a very dynamic phenomenon, and that is what I would like to present to you. And last, I would end with a small note on reform movements, the importance of reform movements or sects in India, to the point to argue that sects in India, which have come out at a different point in time, have provided an alternative understanding of religion in India. So that would be my sort of ultimate, argument, saying that if you really want to understand religion in India, it's not possible without understanding the importance of sects, or what is called sants. And sants, I don't mean priest, but it's about sat, the search for truth, the alternative search for truth that's taken place for centuries in India, and have presented a completely alternative social vision of how Indian society should be structured and what should be the terms of relationship between people and, the supernatural being. So that, sort of an understanding would help us to see religion in a more variegated form in India. So what is religion? Word religion comes from the Latin word religo, which means good faith, ritual, or from the Latin word religare, to tie or to bind. The Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines religion as a belief in supernatural beings, in God. Religion usually we associate with, belief in supernatural beings or God, something that is over and above human beings, someone who sort of explains much of the mystery that you see around you, the irrationalities that you see in your life, right? So human beings' relation that which they regard as holy, sacred, spiritual or divine, and ties that bind human beings into a moral community in relations to a set of institutionalized beliefs and practices. So largely religion refers to certain ideational aspects of life, right? Something that you look up to, a belief in a supernatural God, or certain, rules and principles that you consider as more sacred. But that is not enough. It also relates to a moral community that believes in those, rules and principles and brings them together. So in that sense, it is basically the ideational aspects of life, right? And which becomes the basis for a moral community, or becomes the ties that bind community and belief in the supernatural. So without a moral community, you cannot have religion. And without institutionalized set of beliefs and practices, you cannot have religion, right? So ideational aspects along with a strong moral community is what makes religion. So in that sense, broadly, if you were to define religion, there are these dimensions of certain, esoteric principles or values that are upheld as sacred, which binds a moral community together and gives them a sense of belonging to that faith and belonging to the community. So it's both the faith and the community. One without the other cannot survive. So religion largely, right, then encompasses both the social and the religious or the supernatural. All right? Sociology of religion. Now, why am I coming to sociology of religion? Sociology of religion is fairly new. Sociology of religion really starts with the advent of the discipline of sociology, which again was post-Enlightenment. It was really an attempt to understand society in secular terms, to understand the cultural diversity that you saw around the world, and how do you then build a secular history of humankind. So religion sort of is an antithesis to that. How do you study religion? Religion itself has been was abandoned post-Enlightenment and was seen as decadent and backward, something that sort of falls back on beliefs and values that doesn't explain much on what we see around us. So sociology of religion really sort of comes up as a secular study of religion, right? So, but before sociology of religion, there was theology. Theology, basically the word theology is about the philosophical treatment of Christian doctrine. Theology has been there for centuries. Theological studies are very, in Christianity, in Islam, even in, Hinduism, early Hinduism, theology has stayed with us for ages, right? So, but a theologian is different from a sociologist in the way, you look upon religion. So theologian is concerned with the question of truth and rectitude. Rectitude is the moral correctness, right, in his religious beliefs and practice. So it's basically a study of religion by a faithful. It is somebody who belongs to that faith and wants to understand that faith. So hermeneutics is a very essential part of theological studies. Hermeneutics is basically understanding, or the interpretation of texts. And this interpretation of texts has been sort of predominant in Christianity and Islam, in the religions of the sacred text, right? So hermeneutics, so you have different schools of thought that have emerged in the way the sacred text was interpreted. But the interpretation never challenges the presence or the omnipresence of God, or the faith in God. So what is sort of reiterated and re-established by theologians is faith itself, right? So there's a reaffirmation of faith in God, and there is an interest in the inner meaning of religion rather than the external manifestation of other fears of life. It's more about what does religion tell us about human life? What does it tell us about life and death? How are we to understand these phenomena? And how will our faith guide us or salvage us from the irrationalities of life that we see around us, right? So that is what sort of drives a theology. Theology also has grown over the years. Somewhere the divide between sociology of religion and theology has weakened because, there's something called religious sociology that came up in France and Britain, in the 19th century, which basically was... Can we shut the mobile, please? This is the doings of demon, not divine. Can we shut it, please? बंद करो यार उसको. हो गया? Please shut your mobiles, it's not nice. Anyway, so religious sociology basically, came up at post-Enlightenment largely to really understand, with the decline of religion in Western Europe, how are people taking to, religion and religious philosophy. So there were a lot of studies, theological studies that were done. And there have been a number of sociologists who've been believers, who have sort of tried to understand religion partly from the point of view of a faithful and partly from the point of view of a sociologist trying to do an objective study of religion. So that boundary between theology and sociology of religion is very sort of bleak, because Weber, Max Weber, he had a, companion to study religion. The maximum study on religion is being done by Max Weber within sociology. He was a liberal theologist, and he was liberal, and he obviously had certain sort of, he complemented sociology in a big way, and both worked together to really, write on religions of the world. So this is, what I'm giving you is more like a sort of an idealistic divide between theology and sociology of religion. Now, sociology of religion focuses on the interrelationship of religion and society. So what sociology of religion is interested is not so much on religion per se or on its tenets, but how it motivates and regulates human action. So it's basically the interrelationship between religion and human beings in the way they conduct themselves in ordinary day life is what sociologists or sociology of religion are interested in. So how religion affects human behavior and social organization, and how religious behavior is socially determined. This is what this interplay or the interrelationship between religion and the rest of society is what a sociology of religion person is interested in. So finally then it means that it's based on the premise that religion is distinct from society, which many people who are faithful will not want to believe, that religion is distinct from society as one of the institutions in society. Because for most people who are religious is all-encompassing. It sort of dictates every dimension of your life, whether it's economic behavior or social behavior, even your spiritual behavior, of course, is determined by religion. So religion does, but for sociologists there is a sort of a divide that they see. So this relationship between church and the behavior and action of people, church, I don't mean the Christian church, I mean organized religion. By church, by the term church, I mean organized religion. So they don't assume a direct or sort of an, automatic sort of a relationship between church and people. Sociologists sort of draw a line between the two. They see that church might, put forward certain, principles of how to conduct one's life, or certain, a charter of faith. But people should necessarily follow it is not a given. So that relationship requires investigation. So sociologists are really interested in that dimension. So sociologists mainly seek to observe, describe and interpret the manner in which religious beliefs and practices operate. So they are really interested in the field view of religion. This word you're familiar with, I've used it before. By field view, again, how religion is practiced among ordinary people. So it's really not interested in what the principles are. For example, if you were to look at Vedic religion, there is no sort of mention of the caste system of the sort. There is some sort of an order, but the way in which the caste system got finally operationalized in Hindu society, is sort of distant from Vedic religion, not totally related to that. So if you were to then just look at the Vedas or the Upanishads and then try and see sort of Hindu society and how Hindu society is, you will see a marked difference. So sociologists are really interested in this marked difference. So they make a distinction between normative and empirical orientation of religion. Right? One is the normative aspect of religion, and the other is the empirical dimension of religion, how it is actually practiced. They also believe in the comparative method, right? I've talked about the comparative method before, right? So when I say comparative method, sociologists of religion are not interested in one particular religion. They are interested in the commonalities across religions. So they want to compare and contrast different religions scientifically to sort of step back and understand religion. So you compare Buddhism to Jainism, Buddhism to Judaism. So you can even compare, say, Hinduism to Buddhism. So you want to stand back and compare religions Because the only way that you can understand different ways in which religion organizes social life, right, is to sort of compare. There is no other way you can do that. And sociologists believe in the comparative method. So as I told you, the study of religion begins at a time when there was skepticism about religion, post-enlightenment, right? Science was on the rise, industrialization was taking place, all the new academic disciplines were coming up. There was a skepticism about religion. Religion was seen as sort of retrograde, something that pulls you back, does not really help you in comprehending the myriads of ways in which nature sort of, equips us to grow, to progress. In fact, there were theologians at that time who did, Lamarck is one theologian. I don't know whether you've kind of read ecologists, but early ecologists, most of them belonged to the church. They were theologists. And they actually did a study of the natural environment to show the wonders of God. So it was really about showing how beautiful this world is in terms of how the Lord created it. So the idea was to bring out the structure and order of the natural world in order to prove the point that since it's arbitrary, there was no kind of understanding of the diversity in nature. Even now it's a big question mark. How do you understand the diversity in nature? We've come up with the God particle now, right? So the idea is that how do you understand that? So it became a celebration of religion. So there has been sort of a way to counter, the decline of religion by kind of re-emphasizing, the importance of religion in understanding nature at that point in time. So, but sociology of religion largely has stayed away from that position. It's really suffers, quote unquote, with a tremendous level of skepticism about religion. It's not interested in the spiritual or the the supernatural dimension of religion. So it's the secular understanding of religion on how does one explain the significance of religion scientifically. When you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in the supernatural, how do you explain things? If there's somebody who's sitting, on the road begging, how do you explain that? Religion has a very convenient way to explain it, right? So when you abandon that, then how do you explain it? And how do you explain, say, in the most abject condition, somebody is still sort of talking about religion and that how the God will salvage him or her one day? How do you explain that? So sociologists really sort of were interested in understanding that phenomenon, how religion still motivates people to carry on in life, right? So that was sort of an interest among sociologists. It will be clear as I go to some of the scholars. So over time, focus is shifted to understanding. Now, the focus is on understanding how religion adapts to society. Because at that point in time, it was really about society and religion sort of overpowering society. But subsequently, with secularization, with sort of changes that have taken place, religion has kind of retreated into being a very private, into the private sphere. So the idea is how is now religion adapting to that? Because don't forget, there was one point in time where religion sort of dictated politics, and religion dictated economy, and religion dictated our social lives, to the point that the state comes in and sort of takes over the role of religion and relegates it to the periphery. Right? So when religion gets relegated to the periphery, how does religion reassert itself? So much of the transnational movements that you see now, global movements, Sri Ravi Shankar, Baba Ramdev, Nirmal Baba, So all of these, how do you understand that? This is basically religion adapting to modern society, and people go. People go with their vows. Nirmal Baba ka to maine dekha bhi hai. There'll be some lady who will stand saying, Baba, and she'll kind of narrate her story. Baba said, kuch nahi, ye lo, sab theek ho jayega. And that is enough. How do you explain that? How do you understand that? Yeah, how do you understand all that? So that becomes sort of interesting. And many of you who are interested in religion probably could think of a study on that. Okay. One of the first people sort of to come up with a theory on religion, or sort of being dismissive of religion, is Auguste Comte. I'd mentioned Auguste Comte earlier also, if I can recollect clearly. He was an evolutionist who had a tremendous faith in the power of science. And he was very, very critical of religion. So he was someone who sort of came up with the idea of a positive science of society. That ultimately, society has to progress to come to the positive stage. Right? So then he divided all society across them. He was a positivist. So what he did was that he sort of looked at evolution of society across the world, across 3 stages. The first stage being the theological, the second being the metaphysical, which were both based on false faith and false belief, to finally a positive stage, which is the age of science. Human discover natural laws of uniform cause and effect to establish relationships between phenomena. So you sort of gain mastery over nature rather than mystify nature. So first 2 stages for him only mystified nature. It really did not bring out the real material quality of nature on how it could sort of empower human beings. But with the positive stage, when the mystery of nature is demystified and it sort of is reduced to mere matter, and could be used for the progress of humankind, that was the positive stage for Comte. So Comte was very dismissive of religion and felt that the positive stage is going to really lead to the collapse of religion. The second person who's critical of religion is Karl Marx. He's critical, yet not so critical, because he is sort of associated with this whole thing of religion being the opium of the masses, right? But the point is that when he said that, he said it in a particular context, and I just want to draw your attention to that context. He says, religious suffering is at the same time an expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the spirit of a spiritless situation. It's the opium of the people. So for him, religion is both an expression of suffering and protest against the conditions that are oppressive. Right? So it's also a sort of religion is an externalization of the experience of suffering. So in that sense, religion is not all totally negative, because it has the potential of change, because any expression can go any way, isn't it? It's the seed of the first resentment to the social and economic situation that you live in, right? So there is sort of a, it's not so clear whether he is totally negative, but then he goes on to argue that in externalizing suffering onto religion or to something supernatural, or giving reasons to that suffering outside the social and economic condition from within which it arises, it mystifies the material and social conditions. So the salvation from that misery or suffering then does not remain within the material and social conditions it's a part of. It is externalized to a bigger sort of being, to God, to the Almighty, to the spiritual realm, to the other world. So there are ways in which you sort of postpone an engagement with the conditions that lead to suffering. So that is his argument. So it is also called distorted cognition. It is sort of a distorted cognition. It is cognition, but distorted. You have not really identified the true reason for that suffering. But then, because there is this sort of a confusion over religion, it embodies its own contradiction. And that religion ultimately, will be recognized, for the fact that it kind of is susceptible to false consciousness. Right? So later in the Marxist tradition, religion is associated with class interest. which is nothing but sort of taking this argument forward, saying it represents class interests, it represents the status quoist positions, right? So Marx, again, is critical of religion, and yet he sees that somewhere it is also an expression of suffering. So it is also a very good way to understand sort of cultural resistance, you know, if you're interested in that. Then comes Max Weber. Max Weber is somebody who's done tremendous work on religion, not just religion in Western Europe, but also in Asia. Tremendous. He's studied Confucianism, he's studied Buddhism, he studied Brahmanism, he studied Jainism, Judaism, Protestantism, everything. I mean, he sort of did a comparative study of religions, right? But so for Weber, however, unlike Marx, he was really interested in, you know, how sort of religion, you know, helps explain irrationalities of life. There are lots of things that are irrational about life, right? About life, death, accident, things happen which you least expect. So religion sort of serves that purpose for Weber. So some religions, so he sort of makes a dichotomy, you know, in terms of understanding. When he does a comparative study of religion, he does this dichotomy between religions of salvation as against the non-salvation religion. So some religion adjust humans to their natural social and economic environment, but there are others who address the need for salvation, a need to be saved from existing circumstances. So he distinguishes then between salvation and non-salvation. For him, Brahmanism, for example, or Confucianism are non-salvation religions. These are religions which are status quoist, which don't problematize the contradictions in social and economic life, which don't problematize the tension between religious beliefs and actual social and economic organization on the ground. And salvation religions for him include Islam, includes Buddhism, Jainism, and Protestantism. So he lists salvation and non-salvation religions. Salvation religions highlight the tension within the world, you know, with the world. What are the tensions in the world, everyday tensions of people in terms of hierarchy, oppression, suffering? Those are dimensions that are brought out by salvation religions. So he focused largely in his study of religion on how religion can bring about social and economic change. So unlike Marx, who really saw religion as an impediment to that change, you know, almost like a distorted cognition, for Weber, it was the other way around. It's in the context of salvation religions, he sort of, you know, talks of Protestantism and particularly Calvinism in bringing about capitalism. I had mentioned that earlier, right? So it's in that context that he talks of it, right? Buddhism for him is a religion of moderation. Buddhism somewhere really does not, you know, is still otherworldly. It's otherworldly in the sense of being, you know, looking at, you know, inner beings. It's not really acting into the world. It's actually retreating from the world. You move inwards. You become, you know, what you call inwardly. It's not outwardly. So he didn't see, despite Jainism and Buddhism being in India, any sort of capitalist growth possible at that point in time. So he can sort of, it's a very elaborate study. If you're interested, you should see that. Now this is interesting because in the context of India, there is somebody called Mark Juergensmeer. He's somebody who studied the Ard Dharm in Punjab. Now the Ard Dharm was a movement which was started by Mangu Ram. This was in the 19th century and 20th century. Almost he had a long life, and he did a study of that where a number of scheduled caste population of Punjab took to Ard Dharm. Right? It's in that context he came up with this study called Religion as Social Vision, the movement against untouchability in 20th century. And the argument that he is making, or the premise of his book, is that religion is an indispensable factor in the upward mobility of the lower castes in India. So he gives the example of Ruidas in the 15th century, the Idava movement, where Swami Narayan Guru, the guru of the Idava movement, was very central in organizing the Idava movement, or the Chamars of Chhattisgarh in terms of the Satnami movement. So he says that in India you see that many of the low caste movements that happened in the 19th and the early 20th century were inspired by certain gurus, spiritual gurus, who sort of brought about some sort of an internal reform and also addressed the external sort of stratification or hierarchy that existed, right? So it was a comment or critical commentary on society, as well as a critical commentary on the community, the moral community itself. So it's in that context that much of the change among the low caste that you see happens in India at that point in time. So however much we might be dismissive of religion, Mark Juergensmeyer makes a case, a very strong case, to say that without religious movement you could not have imagined the sort of reformation that took place among the lower castes in India, in the 19th and the 20th century. So it's an interesting text. Probably if you have time you should read it. But of course he sort of qualifies his argument by saying that what it also did was led to separatism among the lower castes. So they got confined to their respective denominations and respective groups that they belonged to, the part of the movement, and never really kind of built an alliance. That only happens in the political field, not really at the level of the religious sort of congregation. So that is one sort of reservation he had with it, but he strongly makes a case for that. So in fact the Ardhar movement, many of the people who were in the Ardhar movement moved out of the Ardhar movement by the end of the 19th century. Many of them went to other movements, because they were not satisfied. So you find that there is a regular movement and people taking to different sectarian movements in India in order to address some of the issues that they deal with in terms of their material condition, as well as the internal conflicts probably they go through because of that. So you find that sort of an interaction. Now I come to Emile Durkheim. He's the third man. So I talked about Marx, who was sort of critical of religion. Second was Weber, who sort of highlighted the positive dimensions of religion as the agent of social change, religion as critical to social change, and religion as fundamental in organizing values in society. And the third is Durkheim. Now Durkheim was somebody who was interested in the comparative method. He wanted to establish the science of religion, define religion in the process, because by comparative method he thought he will arrive at certain general features in understanding society, and on that basis define what religion is. And he also made a very interesting comment on the relationship between science and religion, where he sort of argues, I don't know whether you people have seen Guide, the Devanand's Guide. There's that last scene where Wahida Rahman is moving towards Devanand, who's fasting and keeps removing her jewelry. It's almost symbolic of giving up all material possession and moving towards Devanand. And there's this American woman who's interviewing Devanand there. And there's a very interesting comment that Devanand makes, which is a very Durkheimian comment, where he sort of says that religion is the mother of science. And this is the argument that even Durkheim makes, and that's one of the reasons why he also explains the antagonistic relationship between science and religion. Because science, in some senses, tries to replace religion. It wants to take over the function of religion. And that becomes the basis of conflict. I'll come to that. But anyway, so in order to kind of understand the fundamentals of religion, he felt that you need to study the simplest of societies. Right? So he went to the Australian Aborigines to understand the nature of religion. And there he realized that religion is not only the speculation about the divine, but it's also about cosmology. It's also about understanding the structure of the world. How is the world ordered? how are we to understand the diversity that we see around ourselves, right? So it's in that context that he discovers religion in the form of totemism among the Australian Aborigines. Totemism is basically, the worship of a totem. Totem is a symbol of any natural being or an object or matter, right? So it can be a frog, it can be an elephant, it can be a plant, and that becomes the symbol for the clan, and that is worshipped, right? So he encounters totemism in the study of religion among the Australian Aborigines. So he sees there that nature is not just about survival or sustenance or about economic needs. Nature also serves a very important cognitive need. Cognitive need, because nature serves as a metaphor, providing symbols that help conceive the physical and the biological world. So you use animals to distinguish between human beings. You use animals to distinguish between clans. So you have an elephant clan, you have a toad clan, you'll have a bull clan or a cow clan, and these symbols derived from nature help you distinguish between lineages and clans, right? So, and what he also finds is that these totems are sacred. So there are certain rules and regulations vis-a-vis those totems. But in profane life, in everyday life, those things are not sacred. So he realizes that the toad is a toad, it's not sacred. But the symbol toad is sacred. So it's in that context he comes to the conclusion that what is being worshipped is not the toad itself. What is being worshipped is what the toad stands for. And what does it stand for? The clan, the collective, right? So ultimately what he saw was being worshipped in the name of totemism or in the name of religion was collective representation, right? So nature then becomes a metaphor to represent collectivities, right? So it's in that context he sort of comes to this argument that what was revered or rendered sacred as against profane as a part of religious symbols was not nature or superior being, but collective representation of thought itself. What is sacred is that classification between sacred and profane. For example, the Muslims don't take pork. Hindus don't take beef. Right? In principle. I'm not saying they don't take it otherwise. Right? So there is a notion of sacredness and profaneness associated with things. Isn't it? Similarly, when you classify who you will marry and who you will not marry, what is the principle on the basis of, in terms of the distinction? For example, in South India, cross cousins marry. In North India, it will be incest. Completely unacceptable. What is it ultimately? It's classification. Classification which is a part of collective representation. So according to him, religion is nothing but the distinction between sacred and profane. Right? And there is a moral community that subscribes to and believes in that distinction between the sacred and profane, and that makes a religious community for him. Right? So he sort of demystifies religion and he argues, to put it very simplistically, that what is worshipped in religion is society itself, on human community. So he gives the example of mourning, that when nature is strongest, human beings conglomerate. When people die, people come together. When someone dies, people come together. Where nature is weakest, where the nature is strongest, even culture comes down heavily to make sense of that. And you want to mark every aspect of nature in terms of your classification. So you have puberty rights, you have maternity rights, You have childbirth rights, right? All of those rights. Tattooing the body. What does tattooing the body mean? If you go into the study of the tattoos on the body, it is rendering your body sacred. It's a rite of initiation. So Durkheim's book, if you were to read, is very fascinating. He comes out with this completely alternative secular understanding of classification when you realize that this classification is arbitrary. There is no inherent quality in that or aspect in that classification, but what is sacred is that classification. Right? So he sort of argues that in this sense then, both religion and science are similar. And why are they similar? They are concept driven. They give you concepts or the conceptual framework to understand the world. Religion does the same. Science is trying to do the same, to comprehend the universe. But the point is that religion is losing out because science is progressing. And therefore the tension between science and religion. But the problem with science is, science moves piecemeal by piecemeal. It's fragmented, right? It doesn't give you a holistic picture of the world. It sort of tells you certain things. So if you were to go to a patient who's dying of cancer, science is unimportant. How many of you have seen the movie Wit? Fantastic film. You must see it. My recommendation. It's about this lady who's a professor, not like me, but who kind of is into philosophy and everything in a big way. And she sort of has this huge argument with her senior professor, and there's this whole thing about discussion on life that they have. And this professor says that life, when you talk of life and death, it's a full stop. So she says, no, it's ... I mean, you don't know what there is. And so there's this huge argument that they show when she's fit and fine. And then she gets cancer. It's a comma. Yeah, she talks about comma. Thanks. So what happens is, the point that I'm trying to make here is that when she actually falls ill, none of that philosophy that she spoke of gives her solace. And the same teacher comes back to her to meet her just before her death. And she has bought some books for her grandchild. And one of them, which I have bought for my daughter too, is called Runaway Bunny. And so she says, you want to discuss something? She says, no, because she's obviously lost all enthusiasm. She knows she's dying. She's not able to comprehend what's happening. She's restless. And at that moment, she reads this, short story on Runaway Bunny. There's this bunny who tells the mother saying, I'm going to run away from you. So mother bunny says that you're going to run away, but I will catch you wherever you go. She says, no, I'll hide behind the bush. So he says, I'll pull you out of the bush. I'll hide in the water. I'll pull you out of the water. So finally the bunny gets tired of running away, and finally she comes back to the mother and sits in the mother's lap and eats and drinks or whatever. So that's the end of the story. And she reads this poem, and where this, I forget the name, very famous actress, Emma Thompson, she starts howling and weeping, and that's the last scene where she dies finally, having heard that story. So the idea of that story was about escapism, The fact is that you try to kind of overpower this idea of a supernatural or whatever, you're trying to run away from this fundamental question of death. But finally death catches with you. And how do you explain it? Right? So that's the sort of story that it is. So I think it's at that point that science and religion sort of become very critical, this sort of divide between science and religion. So it's very easy to be dismissive of religion, but there are aspects that religion provides to human beings that we can't explain, we can't understand. And therefore, even if you don't subscribe to it, there's a need not to be dismissive of that. So anyway, so sociologists generally then wanted to prove that religion is a human phenomenon. It's not, it's nothing that like divinely ordained or, that God sort of created human beings or the society, but that there is a logic to religion that is understandable and comprehensible. So that's the argument that sociologists made. So sociologists largely were conservative, to the point of some sociologists being very spiritual, to the point they're saying that you cannot understand religion. But largely what they were saying was, we don't know whether religion is good or bad, but we know it's useful. So most sociology of religion sort of scholars don't take positions which were hardcore and radical. They say, we are not interested in the good or bad of religion. We want to understand religion, and we want to show, we can see that it's useful. It's serving a purpose in society, and we need to understand that purpose. So I suppose that will sort of frame what I will do when I do Religion of India now. Okay? What am I going to talk about in Religion of India? Religion and the idea of pluralism. In India, there's an obsession with the idea of pluralism. The moment you say India is multi-religious, we are very pluralistic, we are diverse, and all those issues will come. We want to be sort of, suddenly we are apologists. We have too many religions, but that shows, how magnanimous and whatever we are. Right? So there is a notion of pluralism. But the fact is that pluralism, or this quest for pluralism, and I will go into the difference between diversity and pluralism, this quest for pluralism in India, is inherent to religions in India. And I'm not just talking about religions that originated in India, I'm also talking about religions that came from outside into India. Islam, Christianity. Pluralism is inherent to it. There is diversity among religions, between religions, and there is in that a quest for pluralism. Right? I also want to bring out the syncretic nature of religion. Syncretic nature of religion in India means when two opposing philosophies find common ground, right? That is syncretic. So you find that sort of a syncretic sort of tradition in India, which is wonderful. It's almost like give you goosebumps. And I will tell you one or two examples of that. To think that people could transcend their specific religions and accept other religious influences. And you find umpteen examples like that in India, right? Third, religious identities as mobile. People convert, and how do they convert? They just don't convert formally into another religion. There are levels and levels of conversion. People move from one religious doctrine to another religious doctrine. Use terminologies, concepts, worldviews of other religions to talk about their own worldview. So that's sort of a phenomenon you find in India. So I'm going to briefly run you through it. And here I want to put in a word that I am not being exhaustive about religions in India. There are lots of religions I'm not mentioning. So please don't hold it against me. But what I want to do is give you a sense of what these points that I've raised.